And now let me say something about the perennial philosophy. This term did not exist in Aristotle and Plato. We do not have this term in Greek. We do not have this term in early Latin philosophy, Cicero, Virgil, people like that. It did not exist in Latin. It did not exist in the Middle Ages in Europe. It's very, very important. The term did not exist in Middle Ages in Europe. The first famous use of it is a letter written in 1711, I think, either 1710 or 1711. I used to have a good memory. Now it's going away because I don't think I should remember now. It's the name of God and forget everything else. So I'm not sure about 1710 or 1711, but somewhere around there, by the famous German philosopher Leibniz, who says, somebody asked me what philosophical school I follow. I follow the school of the perennial philosophy. Later scholarship showed that Leibniz had learned this from an Italian philosopher called Agostino Stoico, who was the librarian of the Vatican Library and who knew Arabic very well. And the research done by several people, including humble research by yours truly, has shown very, very clearly that the term perennial philosophy, philosophia perennis, in Latin comes from Arabic sources. And so let me say something about that. Without doubt. Not the reality, the word, the term. The term comes from the Islamic civilization. Otherwise, it would not be perennial philosophy. If the West had Plotinus and Plato and they're not perennial philosophy, who were they? So I'm not saying that the reality was that. I'm talking about the term, the terminology. In the Islamic context, the first time we encountered this term, exactly this term, not allusion to this term. Allusion comes in the 3rd century. The first time we have the exact term is the 4th Islamic century, 10th Christian century. But the use of the Persian term Javidan Kharad, Javidan Khrad. I'm sorry, we don't have a blackboard here, Javidan Kharad, because not everybody knows Persian here. By the great philosopher from Isfahan, Ibn Moskouye, whom the Arabs pronounce as Miskaway, because Uye doesn't exist in Arabic, that Persian sound, so it's away, like Sibaway. Sibuye becomes Sibaway. Ibn Miskaway, they say in Arabic and also in the West, is Ibn Moskouye, a great philosopher from Isfahan, who wrote a book called Javidan Kharad. The first paragraph of which is in Arabic. Only the title is in Persian. The book is in Arabic. The very first paragraph of which he says that divine wisdom was handed down by God to the mythical emperor Hushang, a Persian emperor. It's a mythical figure, going back to Persian mythology, and to the ancient Greeks. So the idea that philosophy was always around, this idea is expressed in the term Javidan Kharad, which then in the text he uses also is translated into Arabic al-hikmatul khalida. Al-hikmatul khalida. Hikmah in Arabic means wisdom, but also philosophy, also theosophy. And khalid in Arabic means perpetual. It doesn't mean eternal. Many of my own students, or even Arabs, mistranslate the word khalid into eternal. Khalid in Arabic is different from abad or abadi, which means eternal. Khalid means perpetual, perennial. Perennial philosophy doesn't say eternal philosophy. It says perennial philosophy. When you have flowers called perennials, what does that mean? They're always green. That means a perpetuity in time, where eternity represents another level of reality. So it's perennial philosophy, which in Arabic is hikmatul khalida. In Persian, Javidan is nebulous because it can mean both. Our soul is Javidan, it's eternal. But also you can say fakhr Javidan yek millat, that is the perpetual honor of a country in Persian, or many, many other phrases. So at both meanings inside. So it became known as hikmatul khalida. And then Sohrawardi, one of the great propagators of perennial philosophy, was very much aware of this, who spoke about the perennial philosophy, who developed the idea of the perennial philosophy long before Huxley or anybody else. He also speaks of Hikmat al-Atiqa. Atiqa means ancient. Mr. Atiqajat in Persian. Atiqa, al-Hikmat al-Atiqa, which was translated into Latin verbatim as Philosophia Prescorum. The Philosophia Prescorum, which means Atiq, that is ancient philosophy. So these terms came about in the Islamic world, and they entered the West in the 5th and 6th Islamic century, 11th, 12th centuries. There's no doubt about that. And gradually the idea of the perennial philosophy came to be known in the West, but nobody used it. It was kept in books until we got past the Middle Ages into the Renaissance with Agostino Stoico, which in Rome, the librarian of the Vatican. Now, this term, to conclude the usage of this term, since I'm speaking English now, continued its usage in Persian and Arabic. It was never lost. But in the West, very few people spoke about it after Leibniz. For example, there were some Catholic thinkers in Belgium and France at the end of the 19th century who referred to it as perennialists. And one or two people here and there. It was not very much used. If you look at histories of Western philosophy in the 18th century, 19th century, nobody used the perennial philosophy. Things began to change completely in the 20th century. There are two channels for this. It's very important. It's one of the most important terms being used in English today. When we talk about metaphysics and esotericism and so forth, the term perennial philosophy is very popular now. What happened? Two very different channels. On the one hand, the traditionalists started with Guénon, but many other people writing in French began to speak of la philosophie pérenne in French, perennial philosophy, and became discussed a great deal in French before English. French was a prime language for this school that begins before the Second World War, from the 1920s, a lot of discussions going on. Then, after the Second World War, the famous English writer Aldous Huxley, novelist, wrote a book called The Perennial Philosophy. His brother was an atheist, Julian Huxley, famous atheist, who was a professor of biology and England's most famous atheist at that time, who was a virulent atheist. One of the tragedy of Britain is that both it rains a lot and it produces a lot of atheists these days. I hope, inshallah, the sun will come out and they will also clear the mind of all these foggy people. Foggy minds. Especially the last 22 years, it's really amazing. The French, who used to be specialists in producing atheists, haven't produced one famous atheist the last 20 years. The English, who weren't thinking about these things very much, now are the center of it. But actually, you had also another wave. I've said that jokingly, but on purpose. Aldous Huxley was very much disturbed by the intellectual scene at Oxford and Cambridge and England of that time. But the world in which his brother and his friends, they were all together talking about this, all this agnosticism and indifference to tradition and religion. And as Kumaraswamy once wrote, he said, you do no longer discuss the name God in polite English society. That was in the 1920s, before he migrated to Boston. He was very tired of that world and began to turn, as happened so much in the after the Second World War, to Oriental thought. Was interested in Hinduism and Sufism and Buddhism and so forth. And he wrote a book called The Perennial Philosophy. He moved to California, unfortunately in many ways, because California became the center of pseudo-perennial philosophy. And all this New Age wave begins from there. It was a parody of the Mahdi appearing in the West. The first time in history in which you have influence coming from the far west to the east. Influences always were from the east to the west. So it's a kind of reverse of poles, as Ganon would say. But anyway, he settled there, and other people like Alan Watts and others, a number of Englishmen and some Americans, sort of made a kind of quotes unquote intellectual center around Los Angeles, and began to talk about the perennial philosophy. And his book became very famous, the book Perennial Philosophy. It was translated to French, German, even Persian, Turkish, I don't know if it was in Arabic or not, but anyway, it appeared in many different languages. The one good thing that was in this book is that Huxley had assembled a large amount of quotations from different religions to show how similar they were, how in deep things. You have it from Dhammapada, the Upanishads, the Quran, the Rumi, Meister Eckhart, this, that. It's remarkable structure that exists of similarity without identity of various traditions. But they don't have the intellectual structure behind it. Intellectual structure as a response, in fact, also to this kind of Huxleyite, let's call it, perennial philosophy, came with the reassertion of the meaning of the perennial philosophy by Friedrich Schwann. More than anybody else. And when I edited a collection of the essays of Schwann with his own permission in London in 1977 for the Festival of the World of Islam, I chose the title Islam and the Perennial Philosophy. I went to Lausanne and I convinced him that he should accept that title. And he did. It's a very, very important book of his. And he's written brilliant pages on the perennial philosophy. Remarkable. The works of he and Guénon on this term perennial philosophy and its meaning are unmatched. And that one essay of Kumaraswamy, these great men, we owe them so much. We owe them so much. They clarified what the perennial philosophy really is. Of course, it took on a mutation. In America, everything takes on mutation. Even the French croissant was this small, now it's like this. So every country has a mutation. So this also had a mutation. And gradually they began to use the word perennialism instead of the perennial philosophy. And people were called perennialists. I'm oftentimes called the perennialist. This is a new term. It was not used by Guénon and Schwann in this way. But now it's become popular, right? So if you see the term perennialist, sometimes used pejoratively. It's that. The study Quran, when it came out, some people who were against it, many of them were against it because this is how that I defend the perennial philosophy, so I'm against the Quran, whereas the Quran is the most perennialist of all sacred scriptures that we have, along with the Tao Te Ching. So the Tao Te Ching doesn't talk about other traditions. The Quran does, specifically. There's no text, no sacred text that is close to the perennial philosophy as the Quran. Has actual verses. أَيْنَمَا تَوَلُّوا فَثَمَّ وَجْهُ اللَّهِ. Wherever you turn, there's the face of God. That's the heart of perennial philosophy. Where do you find a verse like this? Anywhere. So Schwann believed it was his function, duty, to bring out the meaning of perennial philosophy and to understand perennial in that sense. But you should know the mutations that also came about in America after he settled here, after the discussion began, and it still is going on. It's going on by both who are pro and those who are against the perennial philosophy. Now, does one find a term like the perennial philosophy in the Quran itself? Was it invented by the Persian philosopher Ibn Moskouye? The answer is, although the term was used by him, the meaning is to be found in the Quran also, in a very, very direct way. I want to analyze two terms for you to conclude my talk for today. I'm sorry I began 23 minutes late and I was told I should still give the 1 hour lecture, so I should have stopped. But I've been given this assignment, so I want to keep to my promise. And I think this is an important point to bring out. The two terms of the Quran, Quranic terms, I want to analyze, see how close they are to the perennial philosophy, and in fact they are the perennial philosophy. One is the word ad-din, religion. It's usually translated as religion. But it's much more universal than that. It's really tradition in the most universal sense. The Quran says, "Inna ad-din 'inda Allahi al-Islam." verily the deen, let me just use the Arabic now, D-I-N, not translate it. The deen with God is Islam. This is taken by many modern Muslims who are exclusivists, much more than grandfather was in Lahore 100 years ago. Modern, the younger the Muslims are, the more exclusivist they become. It's very funny. That's one of the strange things that are going on. You expect that it would be the other way around. But for very complicated reasons, that's not always the case. I'm proud to say that I'm not more exclusive than my father, but he was also a universalist. I should try just to be as universal as he was. I cannot be more universalist than he. Anyway, many young Muslims say, doesn't the Quran say that Islam is the only religion? It says the religion with God, the deen with God is Islam. And my answer to them, I said, yes, but Islam does not mean only the religion brought by the Prophet. It's not only the religion of the Quran. The Quran itself calls Abraham a Muslim. And it brings the word Islam with the second word Hanif. Kana Ibrahim Musliman Hanifan, and calls Christ a Muslim. So obviously, Islam does not mean only what began 1400 years ago. Otherwise, the Quran, astaghfirullah, would be lying. It means actually surrender to God. To surrender to God. And human reality begins with surrender to God. Had Adam not done istighfar and surrendered to God, we would have not had any human history. The whole chain of prophecy is based on surrender to God, going back to the origin of humanity. So the word deen, in the deepest sense, means tradition as we understand it, in the deepest sense, because it is not only religion as one among many things, it is the source of everything. There's, in traditional Islamic civilization, nothing was separated from deen. Even how you made shoes, how you cooked food, everything was related in some way to deen. Look at all the things that were sacralized. For example, halwa, the sweetmeats that we Persians and Arabs like so much. It was a religious act to make halwa. It's not a religious act to make apple pie here on M Street and go buy a piece. It's a secularized activity, but that was a religious activity. Every part, whether in Lahore or Tehran or Cairo or Fez, any part of the Islamic world, everything is sacralized. So the deen is everywhere. That's what we mean by tradition. The second word, Hanif, very, very difficult to translate. The best translation for the word Hanif is primordial. Al-Hunafa could be called primordialists, that is perennial philosophers. There were people who from the very beginning accepted Tawheed. We believe in Islam that Hunafa were there from the very beginning. That's why Abraham is called Hanifan. A person who accepted the unity of the divine principle and all that flows from that was called a Hanif, a primordialist. And these two terms bind very, very closely the whole of the Islamic tradition to the perennial philosophy, as understood traditionally, not in New Age way, as understood traditionally, as a wisdom that always was and always will be. Islam believes there were 124,000 prophets. All of them believed in La ilaha illallah. That is, all of them believed in divine unity. That is the perennial philosophy. No one said that perennial philosophy has not had many different expressions. The beautiful poetry of Hafiz or Rumi, among peaks of expressing perennial truth, they're in Persian, whereas Upanishads are in Sanskrit. Ibn al-Farid is in Arabic. Haiku is in Japanese, and so forth and so on. The forms do not have to be the same. In fact, the perennial philosophy itself has a philosophy as why you have diversity of forms. Emma Clark, who's not here with us in her lecture on Islamic art, will explain some of that as far as Islamic art is concerned in the lecture I'll be read by Mr. Boylston this afternoon or tomorrow, whenever it is. Now, let me conclude. At the heart of the perennial philosophy of the Islamic point of view lies unity, lies tawheed. And I said every prophet was a muwahhid, and every prophet invited every follower to tawheed. You've never had a prophet in the sacred history of Islam who invited people to shirk, to polytheism. And don't forget that the prophets, although in the Quran the prophets spoken of are Abrahamic prophets, one or two Arab prophets who were not in the Jewish line, but they don't talk, doesn't talk about the Buddha or Zoroaster, the great prophets outside of the Semitic world. But it universalizes the function of prophecy. وَلِكُلِّ أُمَّةٍ رَسُولًا, the Quran says. To every people we have sent a messenger. It didn't say only to the Arabs and the Jews or the Christians of France or something like that, or only to the Hindus or only to the Japanese. لِكُلِّ أُمَّةٍ, to every people we have sent, every community we have sent a prophet. And so every prophet came to teach Tawheed. And that's the basis of so many beautiful poems in Persian and Arabic about the continuity of the pervading functions. A remarkable poem, the Gulshan Raz of Shaykh Mahmud Shabastari. It says, Ism Ahmad, Ism Kulli Anbiyast. The name of Ahmad, the Prophet of Islam, the name of every prophet. What would be clearer than that? Ism Ahmad, Ism Kulli Anbiyast. So Tawheed for us is at the heart of all religions. And we're here to assert Tawheed. And so the doctrine of Tawheed, of course, is fundamental to the Islamic tradition, from the Sharia to metaphysics, to philosophy, to Sufism, to all authentic Islamic arts, and even the traditional Islamic sciences.